Ilan Pappé's A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples is a groundbreaking and deliberately provocative work that seeks to fundamentally reorient the way the region's past is understood. A prominent Israeli, new historian, Pappé, alongside figures like Benny Morris, emerged in the 1980s by challenging the dominant Zionist narrative of Israel's creation using newly declassified archival materials. However, Pappé distinguishes himself by extending this revisionist critique to its most radical conclusion: the necessity of demodernizing and denationalizing Palestinian history. Unlike traditional accounts that tell two separate, parallel histories of Jewish and Arab national movements, Pappé's central argument is that the history of Palestine is one story, that of one land inhabited by two peoples whose fates have been, and remain, profoundly intertwined. He refuses to treat the Zionist enterprise and the Palestinian response as isolated phenomena, insisting instead that they must be understood as reciprocal processes that have shaped a single, shared, tragic reality. His work is characterized by a sharp, critical perspective on the mistreatment of the Palestinian people by Western colonial and Israeli forces, while also attempting a dispassionate analysis of the resulting state of Israel. This approach has made the book both widely acclaimed and hotly contested, seen by some as a courageous act of scholarly honesty and by others as a polemical indictment dressed in academic garb. The book traces this painful entanglement from the mid-19th century to the early years of the 21st century, using a structure that is both chronological and thematic. Each chapter weaves together historical narrative with detailed examinations of the social, economic, and political forces at play. The second chapter, Between Tyranny and War, 1900 to 1918, covers the final years of the empire, marked by the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the rise of the secular nationalist, Young Turks, and the devastating impact of World War I. Pappé argues that both the Sultan and the Young Turks, in their attempts to centralize and Turkify the empire, alienated its Arab subjects and inadvertently fueled the growth of an independent Arab national consciousness. The war itself was a catastrophe for Palestine. It brought famine, disease, military conscription, and the collapse of the Ottoman economy. It was in this crucible of suffering, and in the face of a weakening Ottoman state, that the competing promises of the British, to support Arab independence, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, and to establish a Jewish national home, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, set the stage for the next, more violent phase of the conflict. Part 1. The Late Ottoman Era, 1856 to 1918. Pappé begins his history in 1856, on the eve of the Crimean War, to paint a picture of a Palestine that was qualitatively different from what it would become. This was a land of just over 500,000 people, the vast majority of whom were Arabic-speaking Muslims, along with Christian and Jewish minorities living in relative, though not perfect, tranquility. The first chapter, Fin de siècle, 1856 to 1900, Social Tranquility and Political Drama, establishes this baseline. Pappé rejects a purely political narrative, instead focusing on the social fabric of late Ottoman society. He details the lives of peasants, urban notables, merchants, and religious leaders, showing a complex, multi-ethnic world governed by the distant but reforming Ottoman Empire. The political drama of the period comes from the encroachment of European powers and the early stirrings of both Arab and Jewish nationalism. The Tanzimat reforms introduced new legal and administrative systems, but also opened the door to greater foreign influence. Pappé describes how Christian and Jewish communities, under European protection, began to carve out semi-autonomous spaces within the empire, and how European consuls became powerful political actors. The arrival of the first small waves of Zionist immigrants from Eastern Europe in the 1880s is presented not as the beginning of a conflict, but as a new variable in a stable equation. Pappé notes that the initial reactions among the local population were often pragmatic rather than ideological. Some landowners were happy to sell unusable land for high prices. However, he is careful to trace the seeds of future discord, showing how the ideological commitment to creating a national home for the Jewish people, articulated by thinkers like Theodor Herzl, was fundamentally at odds with the aspirations of the existing Arab population. Part 2, The British Mandate, 1918 to 1948. The end of World War I and the establishment of the British Mandate marks a dramatic turning point in Pape's narrative. Chapter 3, The Mandatory State, Colonialism, Nationalization and Cohabitation, analyzes the contradictory nature of British rule. He argues that the Mandate was not a neutral administrative arrangement but a classic colonial project, aimed at serving British strategic and economic interests. The British, in his view, consistently favored the Zionist project, seeing it as a way to secure a pro-Western outpost in the region. He attributes this to a combination of Zionist pressure, British anti-Arab racism, and a lack of resources. The colonial mentality of the British administration, Pape asserts, prevented them from ever truly understanding or respecting the political aspirations of the Arab majority, whom they often dismissed as primitive or fanatical. This period saw the nationalization of both communities, as the fragile patterns of pre-war cohabitation gave way to increasingly rigid national identities. The Zionist movement, led by the Jewish Agency, focused on building the economic, political, and military infrastructure of a future state, acquiring land, creating a parallel Hebrew economy, establishing a self-defense force, the Haganah, and developing political institutions, the Vaad Leumi. Pape details how this nation-building project was inherently exclusionary, based on the principle of creating a Jewish majority through immigration and land purchase, which inevitably dispossessed Arab peasants. On the Palestinian side, the British Mandate spurred the growth of a nationalist movement that was initially fragmented, reactive, and led by traditional notable families, the Ayyan. Major events like the 1929 Western Wall riots and the 1936–1939 Arab Revolt are presented as explosive moments of confrontation that clarified the irreconcilable nature of the two national projects. Pape highlights the British response to the revolt, mass arrests, collective punishment, the destruction of villages, and the arming of Jewish militias to help suppress it, as a critical moment that severely weakened the Palestinian political and social structure, leaving them ill-prepared for the war to come. Part 3, 1948 and the Birth of a New Political Order. Chapter 4, Between Nakba and Independence, the 1948 War, is arguably the most critical and controversial section of the book. For Palestinians, 1948 is the Nakba, catastrophe, the year of their expulsion and dispossession. For Israelis, it is the War of Independence, the birth of their sovereign state. Pape argues these are two sides of the same coin and dedicates the chapter to explaining why. He begins by describing the civil war phase of 1947–48, following the UN partition plan, as a process where Zionist forces began to depopulate and destroy Arab villages to create territorial contiguity for the future Jewish state. He cites estimates of casualties, noting that by January 1948, about 400 Jews and 1,500 Arabs had been killed in this intercommunal violence, a disparity that reflects the superior military organization of the Yishuv. The narrative then moves to the Arab invasion of May 1948. Pape challenges the heroic Israeli narrative of a few against many, by arguing that the Arab armies were ill-coordinated, led by incompetent commanders, and lacked a clear political goal. The core of his argument, however, rests on the concept of Plan Dalet, Toknit Dalet. He presents this plan, drafted by the Haganah in March 1948, not merely as a defensive military blueprint but as a master plan for the systematic, ethnic cleansing of Palestinian territory designated for the Jewish state. He details the four-stage operation: intimidation, encirclement and shelling, expulsion, and finally, the demolition of villages to prevent the return of the inhabitants. Pape estimates that by the end of the war in 1949, over 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees, and more than 500 of their villages had been depopulated and destroyed. He uses the infamous massacre at Deir Yassin on April 9, 1948, carried out by the Irgun and Stern gang, as a pivotal example of a terror tactic designed to induce mass panic and flight among the Palestinian population. The book then traces the final defeat of the Arab armies and the armistice agreements of 1949, which left Israel in control of 78% of mandatory Palestine. The remaining 22%, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, fell under Jordanian and Egyptian control, respectively. This outcome, Pape argues, created a new political reality, the State of Israel, where the surviving Palestinian population, about 160,000, were placed under military rule, and occupied Palestine, the remnants of the land awaiting a future confrontation. Part 4. From 1948 to 1967, The Age of Partition. Chapter 5, The Age of Partition, 1948 to 1967, examines the nearly 2 decades between the Nakba and the Six-Day War. Pape argues that this period is crucial for understanding how the conflict's new parameters solidified. Inside Israel, the Palestinian citizens became what he terms invisible subjects, living under a repressive military administration that controlled their movement, land use, and economic opportunities. They were severed from their brethren in the West Bank and Gaza and from the global Palestinian diaspora. At the same time, the Israeli state was consolidating its identity through a series of law of return, absentee property laws, and the construction of a national narrative that celebrated its victory and denied the reality of the Nakba. In the West Bank, which Jordan annexed, and in the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip, the Palestinian refugees lived in squalid camps, their political consciousness simmering with a potent mix of humiliation, anger, and a dream of return. This period saw the rise of new, militant Palestinian nationalist organizations, most notably Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat. These groups rejected the traditional diplomacy of the Arab League and the paternalism of the host states, arguing that the Palestinians must take up their own struggle for liberation. Pape also analyzes the internal dynamics of Israel during these years, from the austerity and ideological fervor of the 1950s to the growing economic prosperity and social unrest of the early 1960s. The stage was set, he concludes, for another round of war, as both Arab nationalism under Gamal Abdel Nasser and Israeli militarism under David Ben-Gurion's successors saw military confrontation as inevitable. Part 5, 1967 and the Rise of the Occupation. The Six-Day War of June 1967 is the next great watershed. In Chapter 6, Greater Israel and Occupied Palestine, The Rise and Fall of High Politics, 1967 to 1987. Pape forcefully rejects the standard Israeli narrative that the war was a no-choice, defensive war fought for survival. Drawing on declassified documents, he argues that Israel went to war knowingly and had long planned for the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The war itself lasted only 6 days, but its consequences have lasted for decades. Israel captured East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula, tripling the territory under its control overnight. This victory gave rise to 2 opposing political currents within Israel. The Greater Israel movement, driven by Messianic religious Zionism, saw the newly conquered territories as part of the biblically promised land. This group began immediately to establish Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. Pape argues that this was not a spontaneous grassroots movement but was actively encouraged and financed by the Israeli government, especially after the Labour Party's defeat in 1977. The high politics of the period refers to the back and forth between the Israeli government's desire to hold onto the land for strategic and ideological reasons and the international pressure, UN Resolution 242, for a land for peace formula. For the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, 1967 was a catastrophe within a catastrophe. They went from being refugees to living under a brutal and direct military occupation, which Pape describes as a system of control designed to expropriate land, suppress national identity, and exploit the Palestinian labor force. The occupation included house demolitions, mass arrests, torture, the closure of universities, and the systematic confiscation of water resources for the benefit of the Israeli settlements. It was in this crucible of daily humiliation and resistance that a new, more radical and grassroots Palestinian leadership emerged, often from within the universities and refugee camps. Part 6. The Intifadas and the Failure of Oslo. The grassroots resistance that had been simmering for 2 decades erupted in the First Intifada in December 1987. Pape analyzes the Intifada not as a series of random attacks but as a sophisticated, largely unarmed, and highly organized popular uprising. The Shabab, youth, organized strikes, boycotts of Israeli products, street protests, and the writing of political graffiti. Local, unified national leadership committees issued communiques to coordinate the uprising, demonstrating a high level of political maturity. Pape notes that the Intifada succeeded in breaking the myth of Israeli invincibility and forced the world to refocus its attention on the plight of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. It also directly led to the convening of the Madrid Conference in 1991 and, ultimately, to the secret negotiations that resulted in the Oslo Accords. Chapter 7, The Suicidal Track, The Death of Oslo and the Road to Perdition, offers Pape's scathing critique of the Oslo peace process, 1993 to 2000. He argues that the accords, championed by the US and Norway, were never designed to lead to a genuine, independent Palestinian state but were instead a mechanism for Israel to consolidate its control over the occupied territories while outsourcing the management of the Palestinian population to a compliant Palestinian Authority, PA. The Oslo framework, Pape contends, was based on a false paradigm of peace, partition, and parity, one that ignored the fundamental power imbalance between the two sides and the reality of Israeli settlements on the ground. It avoided the core issues of refugees, Jerusalem, borders, and settlements, deferring them to final status talks that were never seriously pursued. Rather than leading to peace, the Oslo years saw a massive acceleration of settlement construction, the fragmentation of the West Bank into autonomous but non-contiguous cantons, and the impoverishment of the Palestinian economy. The PA became a deeply corrupt, authoritarian entity that served as a subcontractor for Israeli security. The collapse of the Camp David summit in 2000 and the subsequent outbreak of the Second Intifada, Al-Aqsa Intifada, in September 2000 are presented by Pape as the inevitable result of the Oslo framework's failure. The Second Intifada, which was much more violent and militarized than the first, involved suicide bombings inside Israel and a heavy-handed Israeli military reprisal that included the reoccupation of Area A Palestinian cities and the destruction of much of the PA infrastructure. Conclusion and Pape's broader argument. In his final chapters, Pape departs from a strictly historical narrative to offer his own political assessment. He argues that the two-state solution, long the mainstay of international diplomacy, is dead. He sees it as a colonialist invention that was never viable, only creating more problems than it solved by codifying ethnic separation and leaving the most difficult issues unresolved. He points to the wall separation barrier built by Israel starting in 2002, which he views not as a security measure but as a massive land grab designed to unilaterally annex the most fertile parts of the West Bank and imprison Palestinian communities in isolated Bantustans. Pape advocates instead for a one-state solution, a single, democratic, secular state for all its citizens, both Jewish and Arab, where the right of return for Palestinian refugees would be recognized and implemented. He acknowledges that this vision faces immense political and demographic obstacles, but he insists that it is the only just solution to the conflict. The book ends on a somber note, reflecting on the failure of the peace process and the deepening of the occupation, a situation he likens to the creation of a de facto, Greater Israel, that rules over an ever more fragmented and desperate Palestinian population. Elon Pape's approach and the book's reception. Pape's own description of his work as an interpretive essay that demodernizes and denationalizes Palestine's history is key to understanding his approach. He structures his chapters around social and economic history as much as political events, often focusing on the daily lives of ordinary people. He integrates personal stories, oral testimonies, and the perspectives of children, women, and marginalized groups to challenge the top-down, male-dominated narratives of high politics. His postmodernist approach to historiography questions the very concept of objective, monolithic truth, suggesting instead that all history is a narrative constructed from a particular vantage point. This approach has naturally garnered both high praise and fierce criticism. Supporters, like the New Statesman, have called it a pioneering and highly accessible work as an authoritative history. Others have noted that it provides an essential deeper history of the region, helping to contextualize the tragic daily events unfolding in modern Palestine. Criticism, however, has been severe. The Middle East Forum, for instance, dismissed the book as a sad testament to the pervasive politicization of Middle Eastern studies, accusing it of containing countless factual errors and inaccuracies, and adding no new facts or ideas to the anti-Israel literature. Fellow new historian Benny Morris, who represents a very different political trajectory, called Pape's work in this book appalling. The fundamental divide lies in the perspective of the reader. Pape's narrative is a powerful, if controversial, attempt to tell the story of a land and its two peoples from the perspective of the victimized, and his one-state conclusion remains a radical challenge to conventional political wisdom.